They thought they were sending someone to study your weakness. They brought in someone trained to dissect human behavior, someone who had built a career out of breaking people down to their psychological core. He came with a clipboard full of assumptions, expecting patterns, reactions, insecurities to exploit. What he didn't expect was stillness. He didn't expect to find someone who had already dissected themselves first. You had already looked into your own abyss, walked the halls of your mind without flinching. You had sat with every scar without needing applause. That terrified him more than any resistance, because strength that doesn't need to scream is the hardest to shake. You weren't playing defense. You weren't reacting. You weren't trying to prove anything, and that silence confused him. He pressed buttons that usually worked: guilt, shame, validation. He pulled every lever they trained him to use, but nothing moved, because you had already unplugged the machine they were trying to hack. You had disconnected your sense of worth from their approval. Their tricks couldn't land because there was no open port left in your psyche. Your walls weren't made of ego, they were made of truth. That's what broke him. He wasn't fighting a mask. He was face to face with someone who had nothing left to hide. You knew what he was trying to do before he even did it. You watched his tempo, his phrasing, the subtle mirroring he used to mimic trust. These tactics work on people still searching for identity, but not on you. You had already buried the version of yourself that craved being seen. You weren't desperate for connection. You were deliberate with it, and that rewrote the rules. You were no longer a subject he could analyze. You became a mirror, and in that mirror, he started seeing the cracks in his own training. For the first time, the manipulator felt the weight of being watched by someone unafraid. He came to hurt you, but instead, he started questioning the blueprint he operated from. Your clarity disrupted his method. Your self-control shattered his timing. You didn't fight him. That's what disturbed him most. You didn't flinch, didn't defend, didn't rage. Because when you know who you are, you don't need to argue with distortion. You just let it collapse under its own contradiction. You gave him nothing to twist. And in return, he began to unravel, not because of what you said, but because of what you didn't give him permission to extract. They assumed he'd come back with proof of your instability. Instead, he returned shaken. He told them, "There's nothing to break. They've already done the work." And that was your real revenge. You didn't expose them with words. You exposed them by surviving what was meant to dismantle you. Your existence became a report they couldn't spin, a living contradiction to their narrative. And once the truth is witnessed by someone trained to destroy, it becomes impossible to unsee. That's when fear shifted to them. Because control only works on people who fear being misunderstood. You no longer did. Their greatest weapon was psychological projection. They wanted you to believe their version of you, that you were unstable, overreacting, delusional. But when the man they trusted to confirm their version started doubting them instead, their empire of lies trembled. Because their power didn't rest on truth, it rested on repetition. And you severed that loop. You didn't fight for your image. You refined your reality. They invested in surveillance. You invested in sovereignty. And one by one, their illusions fractured beneath your calm. They called you cold, but what you really were was done. Done performing. Done proving. Done softening your insight for fragile egos. You didn't need closure. You didn't need revenge. You needed distance, and you claimed it like a kingdom. That choice rewrote every interaction. People started behaving differently around you, not because you changed who you were, but because you finally stopped allowing misinterpretation to dictate your movement. You left the stage they built to watch you stumble, and started building temples of your own in silence. He studied you to expose your fault lines, but instead, he discovered his own. He realized he had been conditioned to seek out brokenness, to assume fragility in people who moved alone. And yet, you redefined solitude. You made it noble, strategic, peaceful. You weren't avoiding people. You were detoxing from chaos. And once he saw that, he started questioning every assignment before you. How many people had he judged too quickly? How much damage had he done in the name of analysis? You didn't just break his mission. You shifted his purpose. What they called arrogance was actually alignment. What they called stubbornness was strategy. You were no longer emotionally available to narratives that insulted your intelligence. And when that's the case, their manipulations feel like cheap theater. You didn't care to be the hero in their story. You became the author of your own. That authority cannot be faked, sold, or explained to the shallow. It can only be felt, and he felt it. Every time you refused to lower your energy to match their noise, you shattered their rhythm. That rhythm was all they had. They expected anger. They expected the kind of chaos they could point at and say, "See, unstable." But what they encountered instead was silence carved from composure. You didn't retaliate because retaliation requires a transaction, and you were done negotiating with the dishonest. You didn't want their apology anymore because you no longer needed it to validate your experience. That's the fracture they didn't anticipate. Your self-respect didn't just survive the fire, it became immune to it. They couldn't light you up anymore because there was no dry wood left to burn. Every insult fell flat. Every accusation looped back onto them. Because when you stop needing revenge, you become terrifying. You aren't playing the game anymore. You're watching them fumble without a worthy opponent. They wanted war. You gave them absence. And absence, when paired with unwavering dignity, breaks people louder than rage ever could. You weren't the loud one. You weren't the dramatic one. You were the one who simply stopped explaining. Stopped entertaining narratives designed to provoke reaction. That is power, not the kind that shouts, but the kind that ends conversations without uttering a single word. And they felt it. In rooms you never entered again. In stories where you were no longer available for misinterpretation. While they gathered in echo chambers, rehearsing justifications, you rebuilt your foundation in silence. Not as an act of escape, but as a declaration. You chose yourself, and that disrupted everything. Because choosing yourself in a world built on manipulation is revolutionary. You made peace your rebellion, and it rattled their structure more than any confrontation ever could. They don't understand how you stayed so composed. But that's because they never understood what it cost you to get there. You weren't born calm. You bled for it. You walked through gaslighting, blame, twisted logic dressed up as concern. You gave chances to people who counted on your empathy to remain unguarded. And still, you didn't break. You studied their behavior without internalizing it. You learned how they operate, not to mirror it, but to avoid it. And that kind of education doesn't come from books. It comes from betrayal. Real self-respect isn't about feeling superior. It's about no longer auditioning for people too damaged to see your worth without a crisis. You stopped shrinking for comfort, and that decision echoed louder than any clapback. You weren't trying to prove that you were right. You just lived in a way that could no longer be lied about. That's the kind of truth that makes people squirm. When your presence exposes their performance. You didn't need to defend your side anymore. Because when you know you walked away without malice, their lies age poorly. They replay conversations in their heads, looking for loopholes that don't exist. Because you didn't give them ammunition. You gave them reflection. And for people who manipulate, reflection is unbearable. It doesn't flatter. It doesn't bend. It reveals. Your self-respect became a mirror they couldn't distort. And every day since, they've been trying to escape what it shows them. They'll say you changed, that you became cold, aloof, unreachable. But that's only because they can no longer access you through the same weakness they once exploited. You didn't change. You evolved. You built boundaries where they only respected access. You learned that forgiveness does not require reconnection. That closure doesn't require conversation. That healing is not performance art, it's strategy. You didn't grow bitter. You grew intelligent. And that scared them, because emotional intelligence cannot be manipulated. You see too much now. You catch tone, timing, silence, and phrasing. You listen not just to what's said, but what's omitted. And that level of clarity makes people terrified to lie in your presence. Your self-respect is not loud, but it is unforgettable. It lingers. In the way you hold eye contact without flinching. In the way you answer only when it serves your peace. In the way you walk away mid-sentence when something insults your energy. You stopped explaining your values to people who treat their chaos like a lifestyle. You stopped justifying your standards to those who mistook your compassion for convenience. And in doing so, you shifted from target to mystery. They can't figure you out now, because you no longer move based on emotion. You move based on alignment. You aren't reacting. You're navigating. And people addicted to control can't manipulate what they can't predict. They miss access, not you. They miss how easy it used to be to shift your mood, your words, your perception of reality. They miss the buttons. But you've removed them, disassembled them, melted them down into self-awareness. And that's irreversible. You don't even need to cut them off anymore. Your evolution did that for you. They're speaking to an outdated version of you, one that no longer exists. That's why they keep stumbling. They came to argue with the old you. But the new you doesn't argue. It simply exits. And they're left alone in the ruins of their strategy. You've learned that the most powerful people don't broadcast their boundaries. They just enforce them. You don't need to post about loyalty to attract it. You don't need to warn people not to mess with you. You just let results speak. You built a life where trust is earned, not assumed, where presence is an invitation, not an entitlement, and that makes people nervous. Because now they realize proximity to you isn't guaranteed. It's negotiated. It's conditional. And for those who thrive on access without accountability, that's a nightmare. The silence you carry isn't emptiness. It's calculation. You don't speak to fill space. You speak to direct it. You don't perform confidence. You embody it. You don't pretend to be okay. You are okay because you've outgrown the need to be understood by those who only listen to find faults. Your silence became your storm, and they're still trying to find shelter in the stories they used to control. But nothing shelters them from the truth now. Not even denial. You didn't just change your path. You recalibrated your very presence. What they once mistook for withdrawal was actually a shift in power. Away from their gravity, toward your own orbit. You became unavailable to the emotional bait they used to hook your reactions. And that drove them mad. Because people who manipulate don't know what to do when the game board flips and their tactics no longer land. They throw the same lines, expecting the same chaos. But you just look at them with a calm that says, I've already seen the end of this movie, and I'm no longer playing the role you assigned me. That's when they panic. When they realize you're not ignoring them to win. You've simply transcended the need to engage. There's something haunting about a person who heals without theatrics, who recovers quietly and returns unrecognizable, not because they've become someone else, but because they finally became themselves. That's the part they can't process. You were never their version of you. You were just trapped in their lens, performing survival. Now you move through the world with a different frequency. You no longer tolerate what scratches your soul, even slightly. You don't raise your voice. You raise your standards. And in doing so, you force them into reflection. The kind that burns when you've spent a life avoiding mirrors. Because now, every silence you offer feels like judgment, and every glance feels like closure they never earned. So here you are, standing in power they never believed you'd hold. Not because they underestimated your potential, but because they overestimated their control. They believed their departure would undo you. They never imagined it would unmask you. But you were never seeking their approval, only your own alignment. And now that you've found it, your silence screams truth louder than their explanations ever could. They thought they were the storm. But you became the calm that ended it, quiet, composed, and completely untouchable.